Longo, your host for Inside the Church of Christ, a program that tries to bring you, the viewer, inside the church buildings where the Church of Christ meet. Hopefully you'll get to visit with some of our members, learn about our ministries in your community, and share a moment of worship with us. This week we're going to go into a Bible class and we're going to study the problem of domestic violence. Many people suffer from this particular problem in their family, and we're going to try to provide you some information to help. So join us, won't you, this week on Inside the Church of Christ as we go into the class to study domestic violence. We'll be right back after this.
As I journey through this land, I am singing as I go. I will be pointing souls to Calvary. You know, through the crimson flood, you know that many arrows my sword for us.
Well, first of all, we're going to start with a couple of definitions. First definition we should begin with is domestic violence. What is domestic violence? Well, probably the most common definition is this. Domestic violence is violence occurring between partners or between children and adults in an ongoing domestic relationship. This series will focus, however, on violence between adults. You know, violence or child abuse is an entirely different subject, and we'll cover that subject in another lesson. Now, most domestic violence is directed against women, although there are some cases of domestic violence directed against men. The average is 5%. 5% of men are abused, 95% of women are abused, so we're going to stick to the problem of women being abused in their homes. Let's take a look at some statistics here concerning domestic violence. National statistics first. We learned that 22 to 35% of hospital visits, in other words, emergency room visits by women, are visits due to domestic violence. 22 to 35% of ER visits are because of domestic abuse. 50% of all homicides of female spouses are committed by partners after divorce or separation. Pretty scary, isn't it? And violence against pregnant women, this is one statistic that really is difficult to believe. Violence against pregnant women causes more birth defects than all other birth diseases combined. So you can see that this is a very serious problem. Now, as far as Oklahoma is concerned, we have some statistics from a few years ago. In 1992, police responded to over 15,000 domestic violence calls in 1 year. Also, 19% of all homicides committed in the state of Oklahoma are due to domestic violence. And again, another very sad statistic. Children comprise of 55% of domestic violence shelters in Oklahoma. In other words, 55% of the children who are in domestic shelters, in shelters in the state, are there because of domestic violence. So, if you weren't convinced before, hopefully these statistics will prove to you that domestic violence is with us. It's in our homes, it's in our churches, it's in our state, and we need to know something about it. We need to equip ourselves to handle this type of problem. Well, I want to talk about something that counselors refer to as battered wife syndrome. Battered wife syndrome. Battered wife syndrome is a symptom where a woman experiences repeated, deliberate, and severe abuse resulting in physical and emotional injury. Now, abuse takes various forms. For example, physical abuse in the home. Physical abuse is abuse where there is pushing and slapping. Perhaps there's some kicking going on, punching, striking the woman with a weapon. There's also emotional and psychological abuse as well. Threats of violence and death. Verbal abuse, name-calling and accusations and ridiculing the partner. Manipulation and domination. Outbursts of anger. How many men control and dominate their wives through violent outbursts of anger. And then, of course, there's isolation. There's another mental cruelty where the husband is isolating his wife from her friends, from her family, from her church family in order to dominate her and control her. And then, of course, there's sexual abuse that goes on within marriage. Marital rape and sadism and forced sexual activity, as well as degradation, all kinds of things done to lower the strength and the self-esteem of a woman. A battered woman is a person who experiences any one or a combination of these things. In most cases, there's a cycle of violence that increases and intensifies with time. Well, let's take a look at batterers, for example. Batterers are men. That's the term that the police and counselors use to describe men who abuse their wives. They're called batterers. Well, batterers are men who abuse their wives physically, emotionally, or sexually, or any combination of these. Now, batterers have a certain profile of characteristics that are common among them, and I'm going to list these for you. For example, a person who's a batterer may have any combination of these problems. Low self-esteem, difficulty in trusting others. Batterers don't usually have a lot of close friends. Batterers have very little ability to nurture other people, not only their wives and their family, but to nurture friends and acquaintances. They have a very limited ability in this area. Many batterers are perfectionists. You know, one of the things that I've noticed in my counseling ministry with people that have problems like this is that batterers a lot of times are clean-cut looking guys. You would never know that this is a problem that they have, and that's because they're perfectionists. All batterers fear the loss of control. Many of them are out of touch with their own feelings, except the feeling of anger. They know about anger, but other feelings escape them many times. Some batterers have dual personalities. They're jealous, they're obsessive, they're possessive. One day they're kind and nice and everybody likes them, and then the next day when they go into a rage against their wife, they're a completely different person. They're unable to assume responsibility for their actions. One of the problems that batterers have is they continually blame other people for their problems. Batterers come in all sizes. They're all ages, all nationalities, all social conditions. There's no one type of man who is a batterer. Many batterers believe in male superiority and dominance, some things that they've been taught as children, perhaps in their own families. Of course, there is a history of alcohol or drug abuse in themselves, and many times in the families from which batterers come. You can find a father or a mother who is an alcoholic or a drug addict. And of course, you also notice when you counsel with men who are batterers that they, many times, have been the subject of abuse themselves in their families. And of course, most batterers are oversensitive about being insulted or neglected. Now, I'm not saying that every batterer has all of these negative characteristics, but what counselors have found out is that most of them have a cluster of these types of problems, and having a cluster of these types of problems often leads them to abusing others, especially their wives. Well, one of the questions that comes up quite often in dealing with marriage problems is why do people behave violently in marriage? I mean, after all, people get married because they love each other, they want to support each other, they want to have a family. Well, how do people go from this, you know, a loving relationship, to abusing one another in marriage? Even in Christian marriages, that's the one that most people find hard to believe. How does it even happen in a Christian marriage? Well, some recent research provides several suggestions as to the causes of domestic violence. Some of the causes of domestic violences are the following. First of all, there may have been previous family learning. In other words, children who observe this kind of thing in their homes will more likely incorporate it into their own lives when they get married. And it's not just the man who sees his father abusing his wife. Many times the girl sees her mother being abused, And she grows up and she gets married and she thinks, well, that's not so special. You know, my father used to hit my mother and they were married for 40 years. And so there's a certain amount of conditioning that goes on. Another reason for the problem in a marriage is low self-esteem. I mentioned that before, but that seems to be a biggie in the area of abuse. Researchers don't know why, but husbands with low self-esteem seem to revert to violence against their wives more easily than those who have a better view of themselves. Many batterers said that they were violent because their wives threatened their self-esteem, and this made them angry, and of course they resorted to violence. Another reason for battery in the home, for abuse in the home, is what they call displacement of tension. The husband takes out his stress from work or from failure or from fear. He takes all of these feelings out on his wife and on his children. Many times the spouse may be blamed for failure or stress, and this is just a way of getting back at the world, so to speak, for treating him badly. Then, of course, there's reinforcement of violence. If the batterer succeeds in getting his way through violence, what do you think he's going to do? Well, he's going to use violence again. You know, if you yell and scream at your wife and she does what you want her to do, you'll yell and scream again the next time you want to get your way. Another couple of reasons, let me share those with you very quickly. There's no referee in a marriage. There are no referees that live at our house that can referee the battles that go on. See, marriage is a private affair, and the abuse is rarely seen or checked by somebody who is an objective observer. And so when there's no restraint, batterers feel free to use violence without anybody interfering. Another reason for abuse in the home, violence in society. Now, I'm not going to say that just because there's violence in society, it automatically makes somebody a batterer. But social models for violence on TV and in various movies and books create a kind of a norm for violence in society. What happens is that people become desensitized to violence in general and to domestic violence in particular. They just see it all around them. It seems natural to be violent. Well, we'll be right back with our class in a few moments. But first, I want you to meet a very special person here at the Choctaw congregation. Her name is Jeannie Johnson, and she is the Women's Ministry Coordinator. Jeannie, welcome.
Thanks.
Jeannie, tell our viewers about some of the ministries that we have, especially designed for women here in Choctaw.
Okay. Well, Mike, I think of one, and it's a small group ministry that ministers just for the needs of women, both single and married. There are numerous Bible classes that are designed just for women with women's needs and goals in mind. There are a lot of support mechanisms that are built into the congregation just for women, and I don't know if we even have time to talk about those.
Well, tell us a few things anyways.
You know, I think of the ways that we reach out to the women in prison. We focus on food needs. We focus on quilting needs. We find needs in the community and minister to those. And, you know, by doing that, it makes us a closer group and a family.
Yeah, certainly do.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of spousal abuse, that's what our program is about today. I know that you have had experience in this. You've helped people with this. I have a specific question for you, and that is, what do you find is the biggest problem that families have when they are confronted with the reality that someone in their family, perhaps a son or a daughter, is involved in a domestic violence situation? How do the families feel about it?
Mike, that's a hard one. I think, first of all, you're dismayed that something like that would happen to someone that you know and you care about.
Right.
And then you have to deal with the issues of anger and blaming. And I think that's one of the most devastating things as one who attempts to follow Christ and to be Christ-like, is to deal with the anger and the fear that this will continue to happen. And how do you rely on God in this situation? I would think that would be...
What would be your best advice to a mom out there who suddenly finds out that her daughter is in this type of cycle? What would you say to that mom?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't depend on myself to fix it.
All right.
You know, and I think the thing, trying to understand and to learn as much as you can about the cycle of violence and what your child is going through is absolutely critical. But not to try to fix it, but to offer safety and security and unconditional love, I think is probably a significant thing.
Amen. Well, thank you. For our viewers at home, I would remind you that at the YWCA here in Oklahoma City, and probably in other cities as well, the YWCA does have a good domestic violence program, and you could get in touch with them, or you could call our office at area code 405-390-8732, and we'd be happy to send you a packet of information on this topic. Well, thank you, Jeannie, for being with us, and thank you for being with us, and we'll get right back to our class right after this.
The B-I-B-L-E, yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the Word of God. The B-I-B-L-E, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to Him belong, they are weak, but He is strong. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. Jesus loves me, this I know.
We give our children food and exercise to care for their bodies, but what are we doing in order to save their souls?
A couple of other reasons before we close out this section. Cultural conditioning. Wife beating was not only a social norm many, many years ago, but it was protected in many cultures. You know, the old saying, oh, I hit her to keep her in line. You know, 50 years ago, people wouldn't bat an eyelash. Oh, I slapped my wife to keep her in line. Of course, that was never acceptable, but somehow people used to think that was normal many years ago. And then, of course, there is the one that personally I find the most discouraging, and that is the misunderstanding of God's holy word. A gross misunderstanding and misapplication of passages that deal with the husband and the wife. Some men take Scripture and they twist it out of proportion to mean that they should dominate, even abuse their wives. And of course, that is wrong. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on. Now, you could add a lot of other factors like substance abuse and emotional illness and human weakness, but these are the ones that greatly affect the cycle of violence in homes. Now, speaking of the cycle of violence, I'd like to talk a little bit more about this cycle that counselors refer to when discussing marital abuse. In studying relationships where violence is a regular occurrence, researchers have found a cycle or a pattern that shows up in relationships where there is violence. It's a cycle, so it's kind of hard to know where it starts, but usually the cycle of violence in a domestic abuse situation begins with a violent episode. Everything's going along, and then all of a sudden there's an argument and the husband pushes the wife or slaps her or punches her or does something worse, and that begins the cycle of violence. That's the first step, the violent act itself. Then the violent act is followed by what researchers call a crisis state. And the crisis state is where the batterer feels remorse. He asks his wife for forgiveness. He cries. The victim is lobbied by family and friends to forgive the husband, not to press charges, and so on and so forth. He sends her flowers. They have great sex. He promises to go to church. He promises to get counseling, and so on and so forth. Of course, what we tell people is that this is the best time to take a new direction in the relationship and deal directly and firmly with the problem. However, most couples sweep it under the carpet. She forgives him. He says, hey, this will never happen again. And they go on to the next stage. And the next stage is what we call the honeymoon period. That's the high point in the cycle. During the honeymoon period in a domestic violence cycle, the couple may go on vacation. She may receive gifts. The couple makes new plans to kind of cover over and bury this ugly incident. The honeymoon period moves in a direction to help the couple forget what has taken place. And usually what happens is the lady will drop charges. things are going so well that the man will stop going to counseling, and they figure, well, we don't need this kind of thing, and they just go on as usual. Well, the honeymoon period is followed by another stage in the cycle, and it's called calmness, where everything gets back to normal life and the incident is buried in the past. And then there's the period of stress, because, you know, life goes on. Things happen. Babies are born. Somebody loses a job. Perhaps there's illness. Perhaps there's sexual dysfunction in the couple. Perhaps during the pregnancy, the sexual intimacy between the couple has gone down. For whatever reason, there starts to be more and more stress between the couple. And pretty soon that stress begins to build up, and that is followed by another violent episode. Once the stress factors build up again, they lead to the beginning of the cycle with another violent episode, which is then followed by a crisis state, and so on and so on and so on. Now, what researchers have found is that this cycle here gets shorter and shorter and shorter as time goes on, as the incidents of violence grow closer and closer together. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the why. People always say, well, why? Why does he do this thing? She's such a nice girl. Well, one of the big questions, or rather one of the answers to this big question is this. All indications are that domestic violence is an effort to obtain and maintain power and control over the wife. That's what it's all about. It's all about power and control. You see, batterers have an inordinate need to maintain power and control over their spouses, and they'll use violence or any means to obtain that kind of power and control. And they use all kinds of methods. We've talked about them before. They will threaten their wife. And those of you who are in this domestic violence cycle that I've described, for those of you at home that are watching this, you're going to recognize some of the tactics that the batterers use. For example, the batterer will threaten. He'll threaten the wife. He'll threaten the children. He'll even threaten to kill himself if she doesn't do what he wants her to do. He threatens her to not leave. He threatens her not to press charges. He'll even threaten her not to tell. And that's especially important. He wants to make sure she doesn't tell. Another tactic is intimidation. Looks, gestures, words that suggest disapproval or violence. Some batterers destroy property, or they'll go out and buy a gun, or they'll buy a big knife and simply display it as a way of intimidating their spouses. There's also emotional abuse, putting her down and playing mind games, humiliating her in front of her friends, putting her on guilt trips. Isolation. I mentioned isolation before. That's usually one of the first tactics that abusers use. The husband will begin to control who the wife sees and what she does and what she wears and what she reads and who she talks to on the phone, and usually uses jealousy as an excuse. You know, I love you, baby. I'm so jealous. You know, you're the only one for me. That's why I do all these things. A couple of other tactics before we get out of this section. Blaming, the blaming tactic. There's one that batterers use quite often. Not taking her fear or her concerns seriously, telling her, oh, it's all in your head. Or saying the abuse didn't really happen. Oh, I didn't really hurt you. That doesn't really hurt. You tripped. Even saying that she caused it. It's your fault. If you wouldn't have said this, if you wouldn't have done that, I wouldn't have been angry and I wouldn't have hit you. It's really your fault, not my fault. Abusers are great in the blaming game. Sometimes they use children. They use children to relay messages, or they threaten to take the children away or hurt the children. Or they use male privilege, treating her like a slave or a servant. And again, as I mentioned before, misappropriating Scripture to justify the abuse. And then there's the economic abuse, taking away the money or controlling the paycheck, not giving her any money to use in the house or in the budget. And of course, there's sexual aggression. The use of sexual aggression to break her spirit, to break her down. All of these and more are tactics used by an abuser. There's a pretty famous book out by a man named Dr. Jacobson, and the title of the book is When Men Batter Women. And this groundbreaking book talks about two types of batterers, very interesting. One type of batterer, Dr. Jacobson describes, are the cobras. Now the cobras are the ones that get calm on the inside, as on the outside they are excited. And this calmness on the inside before they strike makes their aggression much more intense. And usually these type of men strike quickly and quite viciously. Now researchers tell us that men who are the cobra types, these are the type of men who know that they are batterers, who know that they are abusers, but they don't care. They'll do everything in order to get what they want. And the other type of men that are described in this book are pit bulls. He says the pit bull type of abuser. The pit bulls are the ones who are excited on the outside or on the inside. They're always up in the air. They're the ones who are stalkers. They're the ones that just can't stand being left behind. They see themselves as victims, and they cannot take abandonment. And so these are two types, general types of batterers. Now remember, I want you to, I've given you a lot of information about tactics and you know, cycles and so on and so forth, but I want you to remember that all of these things that I've talked about are tools used by batterers. They're not ends to themselves, okay? They're the means, they're not the ends. Batterers actually look for victim types in order to get their control needs met. That's really what the game is all about. The tools that they use, all these tactics that they use, are used to gain and to keep and increase their power and control over the wife and over the children.
If you would like copies of this week's lesson on audio or video cassette, please contact us at telephone number 405-390-8732, fax number 405-390-8730, or visit our website at www.insidechrist.com. This program is produced by Media Missions for the Choctaw Church of Christ, Choctaw, Oklahoma. Call 405-390-8732 for times of worship or other information.
Oh, heaven is in my heart. 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 Everybody sing. Oh, heaven is in my heart. Can't you feel it? Oh, heaven is in my heart. The kingdom of our Lord is here. Heaven is in my heart. The presence of His majesty. Heaven is in my heart.